Next thing we're talking about is saturation. So saturation is, distortion, harmonic excitement, and you can use saturation to make things sound more exciting. You can use saturation to make things have more density. When I say density, I mean you can create more weight in that instrument's weight class. Now, I'm not talking about trying to make a guitar sound like a bass. I'm talking about trying to make a guitar sound like it has more low end, or to make it bigger in the low end area, for example. Or with vocals even. You can put distortion on vocals to create more weight, more density, and just have the vocals have basically more power behind them. I'm gonna open a session here. It's gonna take a minute. So while I'm doing that, I'm curious, do you guys use distortion a lot when you're mixing? And I mean, not as an effect, but as a tool to make stuff sound cool. And if you do, what kind of plugins are you using when you do it?
I use the SansAmp plugin from the bass. Add a little gain in the bass sound to give it more weight, as you were saying. That's pretty much where I mostly use gain. Everything else is from the instruments itself. So that's pretty much the extent for me.
Yeah, I've done a fair share of putting distortion on vocals, or even running it through parallel, having a distortion channel and just kind of adding stuff to it as needed, or piano to have it kind of cut through a little bit more, or just anything that might need a little cut and just kind of hide it in there, but you still want it to kind of stick out. Some of the stuff that I've done.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. How about you?
Besides SansAmp, sometimes use a plugin called Saturn.
Saturn?
Yeah.
Okay.
And various other plugins, but then sometimes use it in the extreme, and then sometimes use it just as something to either, instead of using EQ, to replace some frequencies that might have had to have been taken out. Sometimes you have to carve something out of a vocal because it's stepping on something the guitar is, but then you want it to have its identity and speak in the mix. So by adding a little saturation, it kind of brings it out forward.
Absolutely. So yeah, that is the kind of technique that I'm talking about when I talk about creating density and harmonic excitement. Now, here I have a song open here, and everything's been kind of mixed down into different tracks and stuff. But what I'm going to show you is by adding a little bit of saturation to the drums, I can actually make them stick out a little bit more. So I'm just going to play a section and show you what it sounds like right now. Okay, cool. So that section right there, the drums, honestly, I mean, everything sounds really cool. And this is a final mix, which is awesome. But you could make those drums sound more exciting in that section by adding some saturation. So I'm going to actually use this new plugin that I have. It's called DF Excite. This is from DrumForge. What's really cool is this plugin has a different modes for what you're working on. So if you're working on a drum bus, for example, you can put it into that mode, and then what it does is it sets all the bands up to be utilized for that purpose. So if you're working with a snare, obviously you're working in a different set of frequencies. So it moves all of the crossover points so that the bands, make more sense for a snare. Now, in this case, we're using a whole drum mix, so I'm putting it on the drum group mode. And then you just basically start to add saturation. So I'll show you that this actually is basically distortion, So if I take this band here, So you have 3 different modes of distortion down here. And then you also have a mix knob. So you kind of find the mode of distortion that you like. So I like the vintage. It's got a little more, it's like smoother. And then you can just use the mix knob to kind of tune it in. So I'm going to turn it all the way off first, and then as I'm playing the sound, I'm going to just gradually kind of nudge it in there. So with it off, it sounds like it's all dull again. Just like something happens when you turn it on, you know? So in the mix, that's gonna be really apparent. I'll show you. I'll start with it off and I'll play through, and then as it goes, I'll turn it back on.
Last night I saw that your intentions were relentless. What makes you think I won't fight back?
So immediately the drums just like came alive. And you know, I wish this plugin had existed when I mixed this song so I could do that, because I think that sounds awesome, but this song is already done. But that's just one method of doing it. You could, let's go to, actually there's a synth part right here. Okay, here's what's cool. When I play this, you might not even know that that was there. I mean, it's tucked in there.
Last night I saw that your intentions were relentless.
There's a lot of stuff going on, but it's just in there just enough to give it a little cool energy. Now, you could make that stand out more by using distortion. So I'm just gonna load like a stock, like the built-in distortion to Cubase. So just a tiny little bit, like 0.6. So what that does is it takes all those kind of like mid-range frequencies and really like saturates them so much that they start to, it's almost like an EQ adjustment, but not quite. And then, of course you got your tone knob where you can change how much high end is left in the signal. That's a really useful tool as well for synths specifically, because you can remove all the overtones that are in that upper range that create like that high-end sizzle and that hiss by taking that tone knob down. Like sometimes I'll literally open this distortion plugin, like this exact one, and use it simply as a low pass because it has a cool effect to where it takes some of the hissy frequencies out. Okay, so like now I'm gonna play this in the mix. I'll take the distortion off first and I'll turn it on during the part and you'll hear it like instantly comes alive.
Last night I saw that your intentions were relentless. What makes you think I won't fight back?
So you can see how it like kind of just jumped into the mix. That's a perfect example of how you can use this saturation to create density. So what we did is we made that sound, the result of that sound is more dense now. It's taking up more space so you can hear it more in the mix. It's not getting louder necessarily, it's not being EQ'd a different way. We're just adding more overtones and more harmonic excitement to the sound, and that allows it to be more audible in the mix.
Great.
Cool.
Do you want to take a couple questions about saturation before we go to break?
Absolutely.
All right. So first question here is, Joey, I find that drive on most overdrive pedals tend to create a nasty clarity issue when I utilize it at all. With the variable of taste aside, how do you utilize drive on a high gain electric guitar, and how much do you think it contributes to the overall sound?
So I think if you are using something that's designed to create saturation and you're finding that it is destroying some of the definition and the performance, I think the best method of using that is to do it in parallel. So you can do it by duplicating the track. You have your original that's untouched, and then your second one that has the saturator on it, and then you can just balance the volume between those. You will have some phase issues, but you can, if you know what you're doing, you can go in and start to, you can move the tracks like this, left and right, and get that phase to lock in. It just depends on what plugins and processors that you're using, because each processor is different. You know, you can never, there's never a fixed number. And some processors, even that latency will change based on how much processing you're doing, so you might have to actually shift things dynamically. With guitars, you know, there's a technique to where you can even use your most guitar tones are saturated in the first place. That's how you create, you know, a distorted guitar. It takes it and clips it, and it's several different, you know, clipping, filtering, over and over and over again, hundreds of times to create a guitar tone. It's kind of like what a solid state guitar tone is. You can take that signal that's already been saturated and saturate it again using different types of saturation to create a better balance or to create more weight. And if I understand the question correctly, I think it would be utilized on something like, let's say, let me find. Okay, so I'm gonna hear that, show it to you in the mix. So the way this tone was created was overdrive into an amp. Well, actually I could show you. Let me unfreeze this. Yeah, so here we go. We have Tube Screamer emulation going into Criminal amp, and then that's going into a preamp. So this preamp too is actually adding some saturation. If I turn the preamp off, you'll hear it. But that's an example of having 3 stages of saturation. So you have your overdrive, which is creating this sound. And then you bring in the distorted amp, which is saturating it a ton. And then finally the preamp adds even more saturation. I'll increase the effect so you can hear it. So in order to get that to be, you know, a part of the mix, which is very dense, there's a lot of things happening. In order to make that lead sort of stand out, it required, you know, all 3 stages of saturation. I can remove the Tube Screamer, for example. But now some of the notes sound weak, you know what I mean? So sometimes it does take a complex amount of layers of saturation to actually get it to be in the right place, and you have to understand that like each one has a different role. So, you know, your Tube Screamer pedal has the role of making the weak notes and the strong notes kind of balanced out, and then your amp has the role of creating the overall distorted guitar tone with saturation. And then the preamp that I'm using here, or I could have used a distortion plugin, for example, is creating kind of more of a tasteful saturation to get that tone to have a different frequency response in the mix. You know, it removes some of the nasty frequencies and adds a little bit more low end. And I could even further that effect with, you know, this knob here if I wanted to. So I hope that answers the question, but the thing that's tricky with guitars is you have that, sort of that, you know, you have overdrive pedals, and then you've got also overdrive effects in the computer, and you're kind of like, well, I don't know which ones to use. And really the ones that are intended to be used as guitar pedals are kind of built around the fact that a guitar is an instrument that falls within a certain frequency range. So it has been designed to sound good and tasteful within that range. And that's why it's important to use, you know, before the amp, because it's been designed to be used before the amp. But, you know, all the time I use that tube screamer pedal, for example. I'll use that on vocals just because it sounds cool. So there are no rules for it.
Cool. I have kind of a combination question here because they both go so well together. Would you have a plan of where you want instrumentation to sit before you add distortion, or would you use it to move things back in the mix? And with that, do you typically make saturation choices with the instrument soloed or within the context of the mix?
I think for me, I tend to use saturation as a way of keeping intact my original tone adjustments. So once I get something adjusted into the tone, you know, I've got all the EQ settings that I want, and this thing sounds great. I've got this guitar sounding exactly how I want, it's in the frequency range I want, but what I want is hard to hear. You know, it's hard, it doesn't stick out in the mix, and I have to push it like too loud, and then when I have it too loud, it covers something else, and blah, blah, blah. So for me, saturation is a tool that allows me to take something that I want to sound a certain way and make it more audible by creating weight. But what I'm trying to say is that you can use it for other reasons. You know, you can create character. So you might hear a song on the radio where the vocals sound like they're going through a megaphone for the whole song. Like that's where they've taken saturation. They've said, let's make these vocals sound like overdriven or something, like they've been put through a guitar pedal. That's a really cool way to create like a certain type of vocal character. Now I'm talking about mainly, and what I've demonstrated is that saturation can be used as a tool to take your tone vision and make it actually work for you in your mix. You might have this idea that, oh, okay, well, I want this lead to sound a little scooped, but when you do that, you can't hear it anymore because it's stacked up against all this stuff. But with saturation or with distortion, you can still have it be scooped and then still also have it be audible. Like it's easier to hear in the mix. So it's a tool for different reasons. Now when I approach a song, I do kind of have in mind the frequency space of all the instruments, but saturation is not used in the deciding process of that. I use it kind of as a post solution. So once I've gotten everything in the frequency spaces of where I want them to be, then I'll start to listen really carefully. Like for this section, for example, I would be listening really carefully and being like, okay, can I hear that guitar even though that there's a keyboard part happening and a harmony and a vocal, and if not, maybe saturation is the answer to make it happen, to make it more audible. So it's not a tool that's utilized in the decision factor, but it's used to make those decisions actually work. So hopefully that makes sense.
Great. I think we have time for one more before we go to break. Okay. This is from Roger Mendez, and he is asking, when working with incredibly heavy bands, how do you build ambience behind breakdown sections? I tend to use texture type sounds and noises to build up more of a feel into certain sections, but I find that the heavier the band is, the less this method works, which leaves the mixes sounding kind of dry due to the redundancy of the musical content. Any ideas, like possibly using saturation to help bring those textures to life?
Well, the thing that's interesting about that problem is the problem of that is the actual material, what's been written. However, there is the idea of taking that and making it interesting via the mix or the production. So the way that the guitars are recorded, the way that that dynamic response interacts in the mix can be the interesting part of the music. So maybe the music itself is not interesting. Maybe it's just very simple open notes in a certain pattern. Okay, that's not very interesting. But if you were to record it with some kind of really unique guitar tone that you've never really heard before, that might be the one thing that makes the whole mix make sense. And I don't think it's not always an issue of space or ambience. It can just be an issue of creativity. I think the more you're willing to experiment and try things you've never heard of or never even thought of, the better you will get at doing these kind of things, because really the sound that we've come to expect from modern music production is the result of tons and tons of experimentation. And I would say the best way to combat that problem is to literally try 200 guitar tones until you find something that sounds very fresh and unique. So maybe it is the production that needs to make that song sound interesting. And as far as adding pads or textures and ambience, like that's all been done. So it's kind of up to you to figure out how can you add elements like that to a mix to make it interesting but not have it be the same format of what everyone else is doing. And I think, for example, this one part that we were listening to a second ago, I'm gonna mute all of the effects, and this part's gonna sound crazily different now.
Last night I saw that your intentions were relentless.
So just by having like two elements, I have a synth and a piano, it completely changes the vibe of that part.
Last night I saw that your intentions were relentless. What makes you think I won't fight back?
So yeah, you can kind of cheat and like add stuff to the song and make parts like that sound more interesting. But I think there's also a certain degree of artists that they don't want that in their music. So how do you make something like this?
Last night I saw that your intentions.
How do you make that interesting? And I think the answer is just experimentation with tone and not using the standard guitar tone. Maybe use something kind of really off the wall. And sometimes when you have a really unique song or maybe even a simple song combined with a really unique mixing method, that is what creates kind of like interesting bands. Like I think, I'm trying to think of a good example, but maybe like Jet or something. When they first came out, it was like, okay, let's take an old vintage recording format but put new song structure into it or something like that. So it's just like mixing different elements and coming up with interesting results and being willing to experiment